Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking ADB and ADBI for this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts on this important subject. I want to start presentation by saying few things. Firstly, policymakers always say that we have to plug into global value chain, but it is not an option equally available to every country, right? Think about Cook Island with James country, right? And with 15,000 people. Or think about Bhutan, which is landlocked. Therefore, trade cost is very high in accessing sea. Therefore, for these countries, opportunities may be much less or even zero when it comes to joining global production network. However, understanding the process is important for everybody because this is the way internationalization of production is happening. And if you are a trading nation, naturally you need to know how global production sharing or the networks are impacting on you and your country. Yeah, these notes I have, even though I am an academic, I live two lives. One is policy advisory role. I have prepared this in the form of addressing the issue to policymakers. Wherever I go, they ask this type of question, and then this is the way I'm going to answer their questions. Firstly, I want to start with 1 minute discussion about the terminology. In the policy debate, GVC, global value chain, and global production networks are used interchangeably. Henry clearly pointed out in his presentation the difference between the two. He said there's a little difference, but from policy point of view, there's a big difference between the two. Now, the broader concept of global value chain is about vertical sequence of activities from production of a good to its final delivery to the consumer. This concept is applicable not only for manufacturing, but also primary products. Much of the recent literature about global value chain, for instance, focus on cut flower industry or coffee industry, the traditional industries, right? But industries which are affected by global production network are entirely different. Global production networks basically talk about interrelations that bind a set of firms specialized in different segments of the production process of a given product into a single economic group. Now, when you think about the policies, as Henry pointed out, the global value chain literature basically focus on buyer-driven process in the global integration. Kmart or another clothing importing company in developed country like Victoria's Secret, they play a leading role in ready-made garments, right? Therefore, but global production networks like electronics, where they are the leading player is a manufacturer like Apple, right? Therefore, we need to consider different segments of the production process and the requirement for joining these different stages, right? Because factor intensity varies from one production stage to another. Therefore, a country's ability to join production network depend on relative cost advantage, not factor endowment like in the case of cut flower or coffee, right? I mean, if you are not a coffee producer, you cannot talk about coffee network. Or Ethiopia is exporting cut flower. It is a primary product, but traded within global value chain. But this is an entirely different subset of global value chain. Now, in my presentation, the focus is on global production network. The driving force behind global production network is global production sharing, which is the dispersion of separate stages of the production process or the tasks of an integrated production process across national boundaries. As Dr. Shin pointed out, the Apple story, right? Many countries join the production network at different stages in the production process. And again, trade and investment policy is central to that process, whereas it may not be that relevant when it comes to primary commodity-based international specialization. In my presentation, I'm going to use these two terms, trade based on global production sharing. I'll call it network trade. And network trade has two parts, part and component and final assembly. Many people talking about GPN, Global Production Network, interpret it as trade in part and components. But if you go by that definition, actually you cannot identify the role of China. China is a final assembler. Both are part of global production network. Again, that's a big difference between intermediate goods and part and component. Intermediate good, a broader concept which encompasses iron and steel, various raw materials as well. But part and components are typical in the sense they don't have a commercial value unless they get embedded in a final product. You do not go to market and buy a microprocessor, right? You buy a computer. Microprocessor does not have a commercial life unless it is get embedded in a computer. Therefore, a lot of people working on GSV, they mix up intermediate goods with part and component. That is wrong. These are the conceptual things I want to make at the beginning. Now, briefly, opportunities for export-led industrialization. Now, global production sharing has been what I call the prime mover of dramatic shift in manufacturing export from developed to developing countries over the last 3 decades. If you look at this table, you can see total network trade, that means both part and component and final assembly traded within global production network increased from about 12.8 trillion to about 59 trillion between these two time points. The available data does not permit me to go beyond 1990. Data reporting system has become more comprehensive and it enables us to separate them from about early 90s, right? Then you can see developing country exports within global production network increased from 524 billion to about 26,000 billion during these 2 points. Developing countries' share in global network trade increased from about 12% to 45%. Now, when you consider manufactured export from developing countries, network trade now accounts for about 60%. These figures really tell the story, the importance of global production sharing and joining production network if you want to expand your manufactured exports. But again, not every country can do it. That's a different story. But this is the global picture. Now, global production sharing, as pointed out by Henry and Shin in the first session, open up new opportunities for countries to participate in a finer international division of labor, to specialize in different slices of the production process. You don't have to produce a motor car from the beginning to end, but you can join the automobile network at a separate segment. During my recent visit to Sri Lanka, I encountered a firm which is employing closer to 1,000 workers, but producing wiper blade plus the rubber part for BMW car. Sri Lanka cannot produce a motor car, right? Even though politicians want to do it, right? But this company has found a niche in producing the rubber part for the wiper blade. I mean, that is the nature of this process. Now, this point is very important. It runs counter to the fallacy of composition argument against export-led growth. Many people who do not like global economic integration say that if everybody tries to export, then the market will get inundated, and therefore your terms of trade will move against you. Your prices are going to decline. But this phenomena has run counter to that argument. Here, within a single product, there are many opportunities, right? Say this point is very valid. The nature of factor intensity of a given segment of the production process and the relative price of factor input embodied in that segment determine which country produces what component. China is a labor-abundant country, therefore it is doing the final assembly stage of iPad. Whereas high-tech components like the screen and the other high-tech component in the iPad come from Japan, Taiwan, and other countries. Policymakers cannot decide that we should do high-tech thing, right? I mean, you join at a given segment of the production process. Through evolution of the process, you might be shifting from one segment to another. Sony was a subcontractor, Samsung was a subcontractor to Sony. Then Samsung has turned out, in terms of sales turnover, is now about 15 times bigger than Sony, right? Over the time, the evaluation occurred, upgrading within the production network. You need to link at a different segment which fits nicely with your factor endowment. That's why going by value addition is not a very good thing. I mean, you identify a segment of the production process which is in line with your relative cost advantage. Now, second point is very important. Again, misconception coming from OECD work, they say that if the value added is higher, employment is higher, which is utterly wrong. The low value addition means higher employment intensity. The famous Oxford economist, Ian Little, once said, linkages are the curse of poor. If you want high linkages, promote petrochemical or iron and steel. But these industries are capital intensive, right? If you want to reduce poverty, you need to generate employment. At the given stage of a country, doing labor intensive assembly might be a good thing. But you are not trapped in that process. It is an evolving process. Again, Henry's point, successful integration of manufacturing sector into global production network has played a key role in employment generation and poverty reduction in East Asian countries. Now, what are the policy options? This point is very important. If you look at table 2, here geographic profile of network export, you can see other developing countries, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, they account for a tiny percentage of this trade. This specialization is heavily concentrated in East Asia. South Asia, even though labor abundant, is a very tiny player. Then another important point is that this is not entirely a developing country phenomena. Still, much of network trade originates in developed countries. That's the beauty of the thing. When the developing countries are ready, there is more room for production processes to shift from developed countries to developing countries, right? Then, why is that? Why? Then we think that production sharing is entirely driven by labor cost advantage, right? It is true partly. Relative labor cost is the most obvious determinant of developing country engagement in global production sharing. If your labor cost is exorbitantly high, developed country multinationals are not going to come to your country. But a country's success in joining global production network does not depend solely on the availability of unskilled labor at relatively low wage, right? I would like to emphasize the word unskilled worker here. Now, I have just put together two statistical tables. The data come from U.S. Bureau of U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is hourly compensation cost in manufacturing, dollars. In order to make it easy to interpret, I converted each country series relative to US, right? This table. Say in 2002, China's factory workers' wage was only 2% of that of a factory worker wage in the US, right? It has increased. Now, when you look at the table, you can see a lot of important points. India's relative unit labor cost is much lower than in all the East Asian countries and China. But India is a very tiny player. India accounts for about 1% of network trade, as I mentioned before. Again, Philippines wages are much lower than other countries, but Philippines is not doing well. Recently, Intel closed down its factory there because the investment environment is not conducive. Again, if you look at Mexico, Mexico has a lot of advantages in trading with the US because it is on the next border, the trade cost might be very low. But Mexico accounts for about 5%, whereas China accounts for more than 20-30% of this trade. Therefore, the point here is that labor cost advantage is important, right? But it is not the only determinant. Then what are the factors policymakers should think about? I'm going to group them under three key points. The first point is human capital. And again, I'm distinguishing between unskilled labor and human capital, right? Human capital is the gained skill of labor, right? It's different from unskilled labor. Second point is services linked cost. I'm going to define it. Thirdly, proactive investment promotion. The country, even if it meets human capital requirement and services linked cost and has cheap labor, is not going to win an investment tournament unless government play a proactive role. I'll explain each of them separately. Human capital, right? Now, firms in developed countries shift labor-intensive segments of their production processes to developing countries. But relatively labor-intensive processes in developed countries are relatively more human capital intensive when it comes to developing countries. In other words, the human capital is a relative concept. The developed country unskilled workers might be skilled workers in developing country. And again, therefore, human capital development is therefore vital for joining global production networks. Now, human capital is only, again, not a homogeneous phenomenon, right? You do not know high-powered research engineers to join a production network at the initial stage. What is important is the middle-level supervisory technical manpower, right? Again, Henry brought the Apple example. In Isaacson's biography, Steve Jobs, the book, there's a nice interview between Barack Obama and Steve Jobs. Barack Obama asked Steve Jobs, why can't you bring the production bases from China to the US? Then Steve Jobs says that, President, do you know that out of our 70,000 workers, at that time 70,000, now about 1 million, out of them 40,000 are engineers, right? You need engineers to complement your cheap labor, right? That's the basic point there. Then he says, I'm not talking about research engineers. I am talking about people who understand the mechanism of assembly, middle rank supervisory manpower. This is a key issue in many countries. Now, again, relating to this, government-private sector participation can play an important role in this process. Singapore is a prime example. Malaysian case, multinational came to Malaysia because of cheap labor. When they ran out of supervisory manpower, the government joined hand with the multinational to set up a famous organization called Penang Skill Development Center, right? Again, it is cooperation between multinationals and government. Now, in the long run, high technical and managerial manpower is vital for moving up the value ladder. It's a continuous process, right? I do not like segregating policies, saying that these policies are needed for joining the production network, these policies are needed for upgrading. No, it is a continuum. You start with this, the high-level technical manpower development with the government support, it can become an endogenous thing in the growth process. That's what the Henry's recent paper about Taiwan and Korea indicate, right? Then I think I'll skip this. Say people, lot of critique of global production network talk about the smile curve. What they say is R&D activities and after-sales services are locked in developed countries. Developing countries are basically doing simple labor-intensive assembly activities. But if you look at the data carefully, actually this is not a given thing. Depending on the country's policy context, the broad smile can be shortened to become a normal smile, right? That's what has happened in Singapore, in Taiwan and Korea. They started with simple assembly, human capital development, and the learning process through multinational involvement. They shifted this part up there, right? It can happen. And then services link cost. How many minutes? 5?
You have about 5 left.
All right. Services link cost. Services link cost is cost involved in coordinating production blocks, tasks located across countries. Think about Intel. It has 7 production plants in 7 locations. In order to smoothly run these production processes, you need better communication, low-cost transportation, and so on, right? They taken together mean services link cost. Services link cost depend on number of factors. I would bring them together under 5 categories. Firstly, infrastructure and trade-related logistics. They are very important. Secondly, political stability and policy certainty, which is very important. Institution, meaning behavioral norms relating to property right protection, enforcement of contracts, and so on. And then to provide the context for all these things, you need liberalization of trade and investment policy regime. Now, when it comes to infrastructure development, simply building huge road networks or harbor without aiming at what is required by the manufacturer is not going to do the job. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew had a very wise advisor called Winsemius. Winsemius always came and talked to firms before meeting Lee Kuan Yew and then brought information about their requirement. That's how they develop infrastructure requirement. When it comes to electronic trade, building a big harbor is not going to help, simply because 90% of electronic trade is by air, in the form of air cargo. You need to be selective relating to this. Political stability is much more important in this case, because if a given segment of the production process get disturbed because of a strike or something, the entire production process get disturbed, right? Therefore, Motorola and Harris Corporation in the early 80s came to Sri Lanka. At that time, policy regime was favorable. The government had a big majority. There was consistency in policies. They wanted to set up assembly plant there, because our country, Sri Lanka's literacy rate is 95%, human capital base is good. But they immediately left the country when the political instability set in. Then other things, and we can discuss later, right? Then foreign trade and investment liberalization. Here, growth of production sharing makes a strong case for concurrent trade and FDI policy regime. India has opened up trade regime, but FDI regime is still draconian, right? That's why electronic multinationals don't go to India. That's one of the reasons. But China has done it well in the East Coast. The special economic zones have achieved these conditions, right? We can discuss them further. Then multinationals are the key players. That's why foreign direct investment regime is important. It does not mean that there is no role for local people. But over time, when after a multinational come into a country, there can be subcontracting links developing in that country, right? Like in Penang, number of multinationals have come up, local multinationals, through subcontracting relation. It can happen, but initially you need FDI. Now, when it comes to trade liberalization, there's a big debate now whether FTAs can play a role. I'm a skeptic about FTAs. Again, this issue came up in the early part of in the first session. Many of the activities within global production sharing do not meet the standard value-added, the rules of origin requirements, right? This quotation by Victor Fun, the manager of the biggest buying office in the world relating to light manufactured goods, highlight this issue. Rules of origin complications is a big constraint for use in FTAs to support this trade. Now, of course, political economy reasons may prevent a country to liberalize trade significantly, right? But in that case, a special economic zone can play an important role, like in China. But it again depends on the way you set up the special economic zones, right? How you are going to provide the firms with free trade conditions within a demarcated area. India was the first country to set up a free trade zone in 1965. They even named it the electronic processing zone, giving signals to firms to come. Nobody went there because it was an appendage to a heavily restricted trade regime. Nothing happened because of that reason. Then the third point is that, one is there. Market in the country. Even if you have a good human capital base and if you have everything needed for reducing services link costs, multinationals are not going to come to your country immediately, right? Therefore, you need proactive policies to attract multinational enterprises for two reasons. Firstly, the locked-in effect. When a multinational come to a country and become deep-rooted, like Intel coming to Penang in 1972 and develop their biggest foreign operation in Penang, then they have a tendency to remain there, right? the confidence, and they are linked forged with the politicians, policymakers, and so on. Therefore, a new country needs additional effort to convince multinationals to come, right? Then market failure in information about potential investment side. Even though multinationals are run by excellent managers, they do not know everything about investment opportunities in countries. Therefore, market in the country is important because of information failure. Now, this it's an extreme example, but it highlights the importance of selling the country. It comes from a recent book. The CEO of Intel says, barely a month goes by without some country's leader contact me and offer the likes of 1 billion tax credit and other incentives if we will set up a production base there. I mean, it's a very competitive world. Therefore, selling the country is vital. Winning an investment tournament by a new host country requires involvement and commitment from the top political level. Lee Kuan Yew led all the investment promotion missions from Singapore. And then Lim Chong-yu in Penang, he did the same thing. And again, investment promotion, half a minute, right? Investment promotion does not necessarily mean that bring in a multinational. After that, looking after the multinational is equally important. Lim Chong-yu in Penang got American multinational who set up factories there to be part of their investment promotion campaign. When they went to Germany to promote the country, they took Austrian manager who had already set up a plant in Penang to be the key speaker. Imagine he goes there and speak in German and tell good things about Penang, right? That would be very effective. And then, again, this came from in this presentation, fostering M&E local firm linkages should be an integral part. When the multinational come, there has to be a policy environment which encourage them to look at opportunities for forging links with local companies. A country simply focusing on SME development by ignoring the process of global production sharing is not going to achieve anything. There are many examples from these countries. And I have done a case study about Penang Export Hub, how it is one of the most successful export hubs in this region. If you like to have a copy, just send me an email. I can send you a copy. I'll stop at that point.